Okay, so now let me share the screen and let's get to the congressional chapter here. Okay, so now we're going to be getting towards um, what I would like to say is kind of the kind of like the heart of American government in terms of we're going to be getting to the actual detailed discussion of the three branches of government here, right? We've referenced them before. We've talked about them in chapter 2 when we were discussing the U.S. Constitution, and so we referenced them. But now we're actually going to delve into them with their own full chapters, right? And as I've also mentioned to y'all before, in the PhD that I'm going to be working on, that there's classes that are devoted to these, right? There is a class on Congress, there's a class on the presidency, there's a class on constitutional law. So the if you're studying American government, you're going to have classes that are devoted to these chapters. So I want to give that to y'all as context that there's so much we could go into, that there's graduate classes where you take a whole semester on just Congress. There's so much that we could go into, but unfortunately, we're not going to have the time. We're just going to give just a broad overview of what Congress is. Basically take a look at the major aspects of it. We'll take a look at the lawmaking process as well as the leadership within Congress. We'll take a look at the Speaker of the House, Senate Majority Leader. We're gonna take a look at what Congress does and why are they important, right? So that's what we're going to be taking a look at, right? So let's start with the role of Congress under the Constitution. So Congress actually is, if we look at the different articles, the first article, Article 1, deals with Congress, right? So that should give you a little bit of a clue as to how the framers viewed the role of Congress, that they put them first before the presidency and the federal courts. That should tell you something about how the framers viewed the importance of Congress, right? So, of course, Congress is the head of the legislative branch of government, which is comprised of the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? So, if you're familiar with, you've probably seen, if you've ever watched C-SPAN, or maybe you've seen clips on YouTube, you'll be aware of who Congress is, right? This is the large group of people that get elected from all parts of the country, because every state has representatives that they send to Congress, whether it's in the House or the two senators from each state, and they go to Washington at the Capitol building. As you can see right here, they meet over here in the Capitol building, and they have, they deliberate, they have their meetings, they have their hearings, they have their votes. And so that's, obviously, of course, the Capitol building is where they meet, right? Now, what's interesting also is that this is the Capitol Hill grounds complex, right? So when we talk about Capitol Hill, this is what they're talking about, right? They're mostly focusing on the Capitol, but the Capitol Hill complex is very complex because it includes over a dozen buildings, including the House of Representatives office to the left over here, as well as, so it's over here, as well as the Senate offices over here to the right. And then, of course, we have the Library of Congress buildings to the lower left, and then the Supreme Court over here lower right. So you can see how this is a massive, massive complex in terms of all these essential government buildings. Basically, the heart of democracy in the United States is within this complex here, right? So it's a very massive complex. It's something that I'm going to definitely go see next summer. So it's definitely something that I'm planning to go see, because next summer I'm going to start my residency over there in Virginia Beach, which is pretty close to Washington. So I'm definitely going to take a chance, take that time to be able to go and visit these very historic sites here. So, but if any of you have ever gone, definitely let me know about it, because I definitely am very envious of people who have gone and actually, visited these places, right? So, I mean, it just feels like, how can I be teaching this stuff if not actually having, been there and things like that, So it's definitely has been on my to-go list. But then, of course, we had the start of the COVID pandemic, and so that pretty much, put a stop to that. But now, I'll definitely try. I think I can definitely kind of risk it a little bit, as long as I'm careful, I should be okay. But okay, anyway, so let's take a look. So let's go back to the primary function of Congress, which of course is lawmaking, right? If I was to ask you all, hey, tell me in a nutshell, what do you think Congress does? And the first thing you all would probably say, or the legislative branch, right? What does the legislative branch do? The first thing you'd probably tell me is that they pass laws, right? They make laws, right? And of course you would be correct in that is, of course, the primary function. That is the main responsibility as to why we have a Congress. They are the lawmaking body within the three branches of government, right? That's not the only thing that Congress also does. They also represent the views of the constituents, right? So remember that members of Congress are supposed to represent their constituents. The constituents are the voters that have voted these people into Congress, right? So if your job is predicated on people supporting you to send you to keep going and doing this job, then it makes sense that you would not only respect the views of the people that gave you this job, but that you'd also do what they are telling you to do, right? Now, of course, you also have to keep in mind that it's not so clear cut, right? If let's say you're representing 700,000 people, not all of the 700,000 people are going to agree with you. Some of them, they might agree with you partially. Most of them just don't even really care, right? They're not even really involved and they don't really know what's going on. So it creates a situation where, yes, and we'll talk more about the different models of representation here in a bit. But again, this is a major responsibility that, of course, you have to represent those views. And if and this can be easier said than done. If, like, let's say you're a Democrat, but you were elected in a district that is mostly Republican, or vice versa. If you're a Republican in a district that's mostly Democrat, how do you go about balancing your own political viewpoints with the political viewpoints of your constituents, right? It's definitely not so clear cut. We have service to constituents in dealing with the national government, right? So this is what is called casework, where constituents will contact their elected officials. And this isn't just in Congress, right? This is also like at the state level, like with state legislatures, or even like at the local level. I mean, you all even do this with me as well, right? Like, I'm not an elected official, but when you all, send me Canvas messages or email me or things like that, you're reaching out because you need some assistance with the class, right? So I'm supposed to be of service to you all and help you all with those requests and those concerns, right? So same thing here that members of Congress are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to respond to their constituents, and they're supposed to assist them with those national government issues, right? Because remember that Congress, their main responsibility is federal law. Their main responsibility is dealing with federal issues. If it's a state issue, your best bet is to contact your state rep or your state senator. But for federal issues, national issues, you're going to go through Congress, right? Especially if it's like a federal program. Like, let's say you've got an issue with, like I'll give you an example. Like, let's say, my grandmother, let's say she was having an issue with her Social Security benefits or something like that, then it would make sense for her to contact Henry Cuellar, her member of Congress, because that's a federal issue, right? So that would be an example right there. Provide oversight of the actions of the president and his or her administration, right? So oversight, of course, is a very important power that Congress has. This is basically the power to oversee, right? That's where oversight comes from, to oversee what's going on in the executive branch. So an example of this is where members of Congress will request for members of the executive branch to go and testify in front of Congress, to go to these congressional hearings. Some of y'all may have seen videos of this on YouTube where they'll have, like, someone sitting, on this long, table, desk, whatever you want to call it, and then they have a microphone there and they're answering questions from members of these committees that are sitting, like, at the front of the room, and they've got these really tall, these really tall desks and things like that, and so these are examples of, like, these committee meetings and these committee hearings. And so these executive officers are, they're called over to testify, and they'll answer questions, right? At least to the best of their ability, right? Usually this will be like the FBI director, or like the Secretary of Homeland Security, Mayorkas. He's gone a lot because there's been questions about border security and immigration issues. So so that's an example of oversight, right? Where they will try to investigate, not necessarily that something criminal is happening, but just try to find out what's going on, right? Hey, we've got some questions about, this thing that we've been seeing, right? So we'd like your insight. We'd like to know what's going on here. Provide public education and programs and set policy, right? So now, of course, public education, even though it's mostly a state issue, we do see the federal government getting more involved in public education. The fact that we had the creation of public education under the Jimmy Carter administration back in the late 1970s here. So we've seen more of this involvement within education, as well as some of these other programs, right? So more of these federal programs, such as the entitlement programs that we'll talk about later on towards the end of the class, such as, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, of course, also to set policy as well, right? So when it comes to lawmaking, what I also want you all to understand is that policy is a collection of laws. Think of laws as like a chapter to a book, and policy is the entire book, right? So, and this is done depending on, like, which political party's in power, right? So Democrats are going to want to have their vision for public policy, which again, public policy is, it's like a theme, right? It's like I said, it's a book, right? And laws are the chapters of the book, right? So what is the book about? There are certain themes that these political parties, want to establish, right? So an example of a public policy that Democrats would want to pursue would be to reform healthcare, right? To make it more affordable, to make it more accessible. So there's lots of laws that go into that. One of the major hallmark law that has to do with healthcare reform, of course, is the Affordable Care Act, or also colloquially known as Obamacare. So you see how laws can build on that policy, right? And of course, Republicans also have their versions of public policy. And of course, this is going to depend on which political parties have the majorities there in the government, right? Like we talked about before, right? That's why political parties are extremely important within government, because the political parties that have power are going to be able to set their policy agendas, right? And try to accomplish those policy goals. Provide institutional resolution of societal conflict, right? So we've seen this, right, especially in more recent years, where there's been a lot more of this, conflicts within society, especially when it comes to some of these natural disasters, like we saw, more recently with the start of the COVID pandemic, and then more of these natural disasters that we've seen, when it comes to like, providing assistance for wildfires in California. We saw also wildfires this past summer in Canada and how that trickled down to the United States. And so Congress, of course, is also responsible for trying to resolve these conflicts with, and not just within American society, but also their involvement with international incidences, right? Like what's been going on in Ukraine with the Ukraine war that started, in the spring of 2022, right? We're already going to be coming up on almost the 2-year anniversary of the start of the Ukrainian conflict, the Ukrainian war, and of course, more recently, we've been seeing the conflict/war, whatever you want to, whatever terminology you would like to use, over in Israel and Palestine. And so obviously, of course, Congress is also going to try to get involved when it comes to not just resolving our own domestic social conflicts, but also international conflicts, especially when it comes to countries that the United States, historically has been one of the biggest allies of the country of Israel, and so obviously, of course, so it's no surprise as to why the United States is getting involved in that. And when it comes to Ukraine, obviously, of course, because of who the instigator is of all this, of course, the Russians. We've had a very checkered past with the Russians, not just obviously, of course, we saw this, during the Cold War, but also more recently with Vladimir Putin and his totalitarian-esque style of governing. And so we've seen that Congress also will get involved with providing aid to Ukraine because they're fighting against one of our enemies. And so, these are some of the aspects here, right? So, okay, so let's move on. Now, we talked about bicameralism before. We talked about this in chapter 2. So this will be just a quick review here, that bicameralism is defined as the practice of having 2 legislative chambers, right? So remember, this goes back to, let's take a look at this and then we'll go back here, right? So remember that the start of the bicameral system was the melding of these 2 plans, right? You all should remember this from chapter 2, right? Remember the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. So the Virginia, or large state plan, called for a 2-chamber legislature with representation by population in each chamber. And then the plan proposed by smaller states like New Jersey favored maintaining a 1-house Congress in which all states were equally represented. So basically, they combined both of these, the aspects of both of these distinct plans. So instead of having, so we still had the 2, right? So from the Virginia plan, we took the aspect of having 2 chambers, but replacing this chamber with this chamber, right? So basically they swapped this one out for this one, right? So instead of having 2 just based on population, we have 1 based on population, and the other one is based on equal representation, right? So that's basically how they were able to combine those 2 plans, and now have the current congressional system that we set up, right? So the U.S. Constitution designed a bicameral national legislature, a Congress composed of 2 separate chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? So remember that for the House, the representation in the House is based on the population of the state. So this is why large states like Texas, California, New York, Florida are going to have a lot more House members than, let's say, smaller populated states like Alaska, Vermont, the Dakotas. They're going to have less representation in the House because there's less people that live there, right? But the Senate has equal representation regardless of population is irrelevant to the representation in the Senate, right? Texas gets 2 senators. California gets 2. Florida gets 2. New York gets 2. Just like Montana gets 2. West Virginia gets 2. North Dakota gets 2. South Dakota gets 2. Alaska gets 2. Right. So in the Senate, it's the same regardless of population. Population is not a factor here. Right. So we'll come back here because I want to. Well, okay. Let's see. Because I know I wanted to show you all the. Okay. Let's take a look at the apportionment. Or that's not. We'll get back to that here in a bit. Okay. So the bicameral system requires 2 houses to pass identical bills or propose items of legislation. We'll get to the lawmaking process, not today, that's towards the end of the chapter, but we will talk about the lawmaking process and how those bills have to be identical from both the House and the Senate here. This ensures that after all amending and modifying has occurred, the 2 houses ultimately reach an agreement about the legislation they send to the president, right? So both chambers have to agree on the specifics of the bill, right? And we'll talk about how that happens, right? That they have to go to conference committees, or in more recent years, they've basically just had the leadership just basically make the changes themselves. But in terms of, the Senate and the House, they both have to agree on the exact same wording. They basically, it's basically they have to agree on the exact same bill here. But we'll talk about that more when I see you all next time here. Okay. So we've also talked about gerrymandering and apportionment here a bit. So again, this is we'll kind of review this just a little bit here. So gerrymandering, of course, is the manipulative dividing of election district boundaries to give majority advantage to one party. And the gerrymandering occurs after we have what's called congressional apportionment. Congressional apportionment is achieved through the equal portions method, which uses a mathematical formula to allocate seats based on U.S. Census Bureau population data gathered every 10 years as required by the Constitution. So we talked about the census a little bit before, right? We talked about how that obviously, of course, the United States will conduct a census every 10 years. This is required by the Constitution. So, and again, and I've shared with y'all before, I used to do some work with the USN. I'm sorry, with the U.S. Census Bureau. I was hired to be a census taker / enumerator. These are the people who basically go door to door and they try to find the people who have not completed the census, and they try to assist them with completing the census, right? We kind of, help them with that, And I mentioned before how I was going to do that, but then that was in the fall of 2020. We still didn't have the vaccine, so I didn't really feel comfortable doing that. So we'll see. Maybe in the next census in 2030, maybe I'll have some extra time to maybe kind of do that then. But my thought process, as I explained to y'all before, well, I've done door-to-door canvassing before, so I figured this was no different. Just instead of doing it for political campaigns, now I'm doing it for federal government when it comes to census. But again, the point of having a U.S. census is that we have to see those population changes, right? As I mentioned to y'all before, that population is constantly changing. You have people passing away, new babies being born, people moving to different parts of the country. So all of that data has to be calculated as a means to determine how much congressional apportionment is going to occur within different states here, right? So that's why I wanted to show this to you all, right? So this is the most up-to-date apportionment changes based on the 2020 census, right? So this is interesting because the way the census works, right, is that you have 435 House members. It's capped here, right? So even if population increases, you still only have 435 members. Now, there has been talk about expanding the membership because of the fact that there's been more, the country has been growing since they capped that number almost about 100 years ago. But again, that's a debate for another time. So anyway, so the total number of seats the House of Representatives has been capped at 435. The apportionment of seats by states may change each decade following the official census. In this map, we see the changes in seat reapportionment that followed the 2020 census. So after the 2020 census information was documented, we can see this is the congressional apportionment, right? So remember that every state, they still get at least one in the House, right? So because you have to have at least one, that's an at-large seat, right? So that's where states like Wyoming, Alaska, Vermont, they're still going to have their one, right? North Dakota, South Dakota. As I mentioned to y'all before, there's more people that live down here in the valley where we live. There's more people that live here than even in a state like Alaska. So if the valley was its own if it was its own state, it could have its own it could have its own congressional delegation. Maybe starting off at 1, but it probably would even get to 2 here. If we were on our state, just to let y'all know that. But right. So what I want y'all to see is that a few of these states were able to gain seats. So look at Texas. Texas is now at 38 members of the House. because Texas was able to gain a couple of seats because a lot of people have been moving to Texas. Also notice that California has lost some seats. A lot of people are making the argument that a lot of those people that were from California, they moved to Texas, right? So with that came that representation, right? Not everyone that moved to Texas came from California, but you all have heard like the meme, you've seen the memes and you've heard the like the "Don't California my Texas" type of stuff, you know, because a lot of these people that have come to Texas haven't come from California, you know, and for a lot of reasons, especially when it comes to the affordability or the lack of affordability, but of course also Texas is starting to become a little bit more unaffordable, especially like in like Austin. Like if you know what's going on in Austin, you'll see, you know, just how unaffordable it's become. But yeah, so Texas gained some seats, so did Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Oregon, Montana went from 2 to 1. So those are the states that gained seats. The states that lost seats, not just California, but also a lot over here, like in the Rust Belt here. You know, a lot of people have been leaving Michigan. Like Detroit has been a community that has really been hit hard with people leaving because of the, you know, the unemployment, with the leaving of a lot of these major manufacturing jobs, you know, going overseas, and so there's been some of those issues. But yeah, a lot of these Rust Belt states, you know, have lost, you know, such as Ohio, Illinois also lost some representation. New York also lost, you know, a seat here, you know, so I was reading in the news that they barely lost one. So they lost one here, as well as Pennsylvania and West Virginia, now down to two House seats here, right? And then for the most part, most of the states have stayed the same in terms of their representation. But again, you know, so Colorado was able to pick up a couple as well, right? So just keep in mind that this is one of the reasons why we have the 2020 census, or why we have the census, right? To determine the apportionment numbers for the states in terms of their House seats, right? And then moving on to the gerrymandering issue, this is an example that was noted for districts within the Austin area, right? So these maps show examples of gerrymandering in Texas, where the Republican-controlled legislature has redrawn House districts to reduce the number of Democrat seats by combining voters in Austin with those in surrounding counties, sometimes even several hundred miles away. Today, Austin is represented by 6 different congressional representatives, right? So as you can see here, back in the early 2000s, Austin just had, you know, a few of these legislative, you know, a few of these congressional seats, but now they've expanded a lot more. Now, of course, you could also make the argument that Austin has also really gained in population in the last several years, and you know that also necessitates the need for more of these districts. But what the argument is being made is that, do they need to be divided like this, right? Couldn't you, you know, could you just have just one district here, like in the middle of Austin? You know, does Austin necessarily need to be divided this, you know, like this, right? Now, again, let's also mention this, that like keep in mind, and I think we've mentioned this before, right? When we talked about gerrymandering, that because you can't just have a bunch of boxes, because the district, you know, because not everyone lives in the same, the population is not distributed equally, right? You can't just go through the entire state of Texas and just make a bunch of boxes, right? So you do have to compensate for, you know, like the Austin area that has a lot more population than, let's say, like in the Panhandle, right? But the way the lines are drawn definitely does become something, you know, because this goes all the way down to San Antonio, right? This is Lloyd Doggett's district, the 35th district. So he represents Austin, but then it goes along I-35 and goes down to San Antonio, right? So you know, like I've said, we've talked about this before in terms of, you know, how these districts are set up. It definitely becomes a situation where, you know, yeah, it's you know, do they need to be drawn up this way, or is it done for political reasons? Because also keep in mind that the state legislatures are the ones who draw the lines, not just for their own districts, but also for the districts of members of Congress, right? Again, another example of federalism where we devolve that power to the states to decide the, you know, the congressional districts here. Okay, so there's 3 kinds of powers granted to Congress here. So we have the enumerated power, which is power that is explicitly stated within the Constitution as powers belonging to Congress. So this, of course, is your Article 1, Section 8 powers that we went over before in Chapter 2, where we talked about the power to collect taxes, the power to raise an army, the power to declare war. These, of course, are, you know, the naturalization, immigration law. That's a power that Congress has. So these are the ones that are explicitly stated within the Constitution, particularly Article 1, Section 8. Now, we also have what are implied and inherent powers. So an implied power is not specifically detailed in the Constitution, but inferred as necessary to achieve the objectives of the national government, right? And then inherent power is, while neither enumerated nor implied, must be assumed to exist as a direct result of the country's existence, right? So implied is, this is more so like the details that are not mentioned in the enumerated powers that Congress then fills in, right? So we talked about this before, right? That when it comes to the power of collecting taxes, it doesn't say how Congress is going to do this, right? It doesn't say that Congress is going to delegate that power to the federal to the executive branch through the creation of the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS is not mentioned in the Constitution, but it's implied that Congress can decide how they're going to collect those taxes, right? It just says that you're supposed to do it, but then Congress then goes and decides how they're going to collect those. And we'll talk about delegated power here a little bit later, where Congress can pass power off to the executive branch. That's an example in terms of the actual collecting of the taxes, right? Congress needs those taxes in order to operate, but Congress has decided that it's not going to be the senators and the legislatures that actually go and run the system to collect the taxes. We're going to hand that off to the executive branch because the executive branch is far larger and they have more staffers working there. So we're going to let them handle that. And then, of course, like we said, inherent, it's assumed to exist as a direct result of the country's existence here, right? So an example of inherent power, let me give you another example, would be, so we have the Air Force today, right? The Air Force, of course, is part of the armed services, they're part of the military, right? But the Constitution does not mention the Air Service at all in the Constitution. And of course, the simple reason for that is because airplanes weren't invented back then, right? There was no concept of air flight, right? This wasn't something, I mean, we had, there was maybe some ideas for that, but in terms of actually having like actual like vehicles, like, where we could actually fly, that was something that was just beyond the scope of even Benjamin Franklin, had dabbled with some of that, and things like that. But for the most part, this was something that wouldn't become a reality until the Wright brothers, right? So you could make an argument that now that we have these airplanes, we can use them for the military, right? So you don't have to have it in the Constitution to say, okay, we can create an Air Force, because we can just assume that because it exists and we have military operations for, we have the Army and we have the Navy, we can assume that this is now a new form of transportation. Well, it's not an assumption, it is a new form of transportation. And so now we can assume that we can use that transportation to assist our military, right? So that's an example of an inherent power as well, right? So, okay, really great. And of course, this is the tax revenue, like we've talked about before. We'll talk more about this here when we get to the domestic policy here. We'll talk about where all the money comes from. As you can see, most of it, almost all of it, is either through individual tax filings. These are the taxes that you have to do in April, and the payroll taxes that come out of your paycheck. So every month when I get my paycheck, it's not going to be what my base salary is going to be, right? There's a lot of taxes that come out of it, right? So yeah, the ability to levy and collect taxes is the first and most important of Congress's enumerated powers. And of course, we also had, we also had the creation of the payroll taxes and the individual income taxes here in more recent years. Well, not too recent, more so like about 100 years ago. But we've seen that U.S. federal tax revenue totaled $3.42 trillion, right? So that's where a majority of it, so very little of it comes from corporate income, as well as some of these other sources. Most of it comes from individual tax filings, as well as payroll taxes, that come from the money that we earn here, right? Okay, all right. Let's see, because I know it's already going to be almost time to go, right? So we leave at 12:35 here. Okay, so we'll talk about some of this here a little bit later here. Yeah, okay, we'll get to the models of representation here. So yeah, this is mostly what we'll talk about here next time here, and then we'll talk about the delegation of the speaker and then the committees. Yeah, we'll get to this here next time. So okay, all right. So yeah. So okay, we'll stop the share here. Let me go to stop it here because I know it's already gonna be time. Let me stop the record here. Okay.